Okay, well, greetings everybody, and thank you for inviting me today. I've really enjoyed the talks. They've been super interesting, and I've learned a lot. I'm going to be scaling upwards, so I'm going to take a little bit different approach. We've been really focused on a small scale, looking at genetics and looking at populations, and now I'm going to kind of scale upward and look at the relationship of these plants with other parts of the food chain. So talking about the insects and then the birds that all depend on them. So it's going to be a kind of, we're going to be viewing the same question from a different direction. So in the news, there's been lots and lots of information and news items about declines, both in birds and in insects and pollinators. So there was a big study on birds that came out earlier this year, talking about, almost 3 billion birds that have disappeared since the 1970s. And then similarly, there's been lots and lots of interest and concern about declines in pollinators and declines in insects populations overall. I should back up. I should have introduced myself more. So yes, I'm at Penn State. I'm an avian ecologist, so birds are my specialty. And then I've also am one of the wildlife extension specialists. And in that role, I work a lot with the public and public education and taking sort of research out to the public. And my personal interests, of course, my research has been involved in birds, and I'm also interested in birds as a hobby and recreationally, and then very interested in sort of the native plant part of it. I actually got into birds through taking a plant taxonomy course while I was in college and getting into spring ephemerals, and kind of that was my connection then with all of this. And so anyway, but I'm super interested also in this whole landscaping for wildlife and using native plants in backyards. So that's kind of my background. And as I said, we're in a time right now where there's a lot of interest and concern about declines in these wildlife and insect populations. And so the good news, though, is that we can make a difference. And I know a lot of you probably know Doug Talamay in the entomology department at University of Delaware. And he's done a couple of books, and his last one is Nature's Best Hope. And it's a very inspirational book, and it's a really down-to-earth book. But basically, it's saying that we can make a difference. We can make a difference in all of these little spots that we influence, whether you have a small backyard, you own 50 acres, or whether you're, live in an apartment and just can influence the urban spaces around you. And so that we can make a difference, and that we really need to make a difference, and each of us work through that. And really the way to make a difference is by changing our whole perception of how we landscape. So getting away from that idea of lawns and non-native plants, and really going back to native plants. And not only native plants for native plants' sake, we learned a lot today about plants that have declined in number and are really rare, but looking at their role that they play within this more complex web of organisms. So all of these pieces fit together. And so we're trying to rebuild, native plants are sort of the ground floor. So landscaping with native plants really can provide that needed habitat for birds, and also critical habitat for declining populations of pollinators. And one of the interesting things that particularly Doug Talamay and the students have shown is that many of the non-native plants that we have just don't support those insect populations. So they're not being eaten by the different caterpillars, or they're not being, and in some ways, of course, that's why they were cultivated, that people wanted something that wouldn't be a mess, wouldn't be eaten in their backyard. But because of that, they're not really adding functionally to to the whole natural ecosystem. And I had a friend, and we had I can't remember what species it was, but it was non-native. And my husband said, well, the flowers are pretty. And he goes, yeah, but you might as well just have a plastic bush for what it's, what it's contributing. And so really thinking about that bigger scale and thinking about the connections between the plants and the other organisms. And even small patches of native plants, so even a small little backyard, can provide an important place for migrants to stop and refuel. And I put these in, I don't know if you remember this, this April. Remember how all of a sudden we'd had a winter, we didn't have any snow, and then all of a sudden in April it started snowing. And it was a time when we had a lot of migrants back, and these are rose-breasted grosbeaks, but they were coming down into yards, they were concentrating, they were searching for food, and it was really noticeable at that time, again, because we had that weather change. But this is happening during both spring and fall migration. And I just put this up because this is just really a neat website. This is called Birdcast. And this is a map of the United States. These are the green dots are weather radar sites. And so we have weather radar sites that are tracking our, the weather patterns, but these patterns also pick up migrating birds. Most songbirds migrate at night. So they fly at night. And then when sunrise occurs, they, look around, where am I? Here I am flying over State College or over New York City, wherever I am. And then they try to find a space to land into, and then they will feed, really voracious, well, they'll rest and they'll feed during the day and then take off again the next night, or maybe stay a couple of days, but they're flying at night, they're feeding during the day. And so they're flying over new areas. And so it's at this time that you find big concentrations of birds in places like cemeteries, or any, sort of patches of habitat that you've got. So if you've got a landscaped yard or a landscaped, a place with native plants that supports the insects and the fruit producing shrubs that they need, then that will, then will be a place that they can come down to. So what this map shows is this is a live migration map, and you can get on it and you can see, this was for the night of September 9th, and they have a line that comes across where sunset is in red, and when sunset comes across, and then yellow is sunrise, and then they've got, this is showing the bird migration. So basically what they've done is filtered out the weather, and they're getting the birds, and then are showing that, that bird migration that's occurring. And the lighter the color, the more intense the migration is. And they've got the arrows showing the direction that the birds are flying. And I just checked it. So last night was a pretty good night, and Monday night's supposed to be an incredible night. So that will be, start looking around your spaces to see these birds that are coming in. And these are ones that are now, going to come in, and they've got to refuel because they're going to fly, and then they're going to go straight across the Gulf of Mexico. So, but each place along the way, they've got to be fueling up. So anyway, so that's our, so this is just a great website to look at, but it's a great way to also connect your plants with these birds, the insects and these birds. So when we're selecting and designing plantings, whether it's in a park or a yard, try to think ecologically when selecting them. And again, the first part of thinking ecologically is thinking those native plants that are, have co-evolved with these insects and these birds and these other organisms within these areas. So this is Doug Talamay's work, and he looked at the importance of native plants for native insects. So it's Doug Talamay's website, Bringing Nature Home. And this was one of the first books he did, but he's got, the different, these are trees, but he's also got it for herbaceous plants. And then how many species of moths or butterflies are supported. And actually, I checked out another site, and the Baptista has 20 different species of caterpillars that will feed on it here in central or in Pennsylvania. So of course the plants are trying not to be eaten, and so they're producing different ways of of keeping from being eaten. The insects are trying to eat them, so they're developing. Some are very specialized. Some plants have, are only a couple of insects can feed on. Others, many can. So again, the oak is one where you've got 534 different species of moths that can be supported by it. And then somebody asked the question of, would birds feed on those caterpillars that were feeding on the Baptista? And in general, birds are not highly specialized. I mean, they wouldn't be, like, I'm only going to eat this caterpillar. They will avoid ones that are toxic or bad tasting. So that's, the route the monarch has taken. But in general, they're not being super selective in terms of that. But so you can look at, so these are, numbers of insects supported. And insects are the primary source of food for birds during the breeding season. So during the breeding season, our seed feeders aren't really that effective. They may use them a little bit, but what birds need are insects. And they also did some interesting work where they had one of the GoPro cameras on chickadee nest boxes. But anyway, it's something like, to raise a brood of chickadees takes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars. So again, you've got to have the native plants that are supporting the native insects that the birds then can feed on to raise their young, so that we have the birds. And there's a lot of concern that many of the declines, there are a lot of factors influencing birds, but loss of these insect populations is one of those concerns, because of course the more food you get and the closer it is to your nest, that can increase your nest success and the number of young that you can produce. And so so that's our kind of connection between the native plants and everything else and the birds and the insects that are in our yard, so that those non-natives just aren't doing it in terms of those insect populations. So there's something called the Native Plant Finder, and this is again, it's based on that Doug Talamay's work and his students' work. It's with National Wildlife Federation, Native Plant Finder, and you can look at it through the plants, like you put in your zip code, and then you find out, these are woody plants or herbaceous plants and how many insects that they support. Or you can look at the butterflies and caterpillars and see what plants they use. And so it's kind of an interesting way to kind of look at that, those connections. So when selecting plants, think about their function in terms of providing food and cover. And so one of the first is to have a few of these sort of what are called keystone species that will support, a wide range of insects. So white oak, that's a big one. And so that's one that's going to support a number of different insects and so that's one of our keystone species. So it's good to have some of those in your yard. The way suburban developments occur, we're either going into an area and removing vegetation, so in forested sites. And so in a case like that, it would be, these are species that are important to keep, or you're in farmland and you're replanting. And again, then you're thinking more about what plants you're putting in there. So on the herbaceous side, goldenrod is one of the best. And, that's one that people don't often have. It's more of a wild looking, more of a field type. People don't usually have it in their yard, but here's goldenrod mixed within a little, wildflower patch within a yard. So the goldenrod's a really important keystone species. Again, similar to the way oak is for the woody species, goldenrod is another one. Joe pieweed is another one. Joe pieweed has got a whole bunch of different insects that feed on it. So you think that way on one side, but then of course there also other species are important because one or a few species need them to survive. So you can't just think, I want the one that supports the most or the biggest numbers or something like that. You want to have, you know, you got to kind of, again, think sort of these different pieces. And so monarchs specialize on milkweed. And so having milkweed, butterfly weed, you know, are plants that you can have that will have that then the monarch caterpillars will specialize on. Of course, the adults, once they're, you know, they're feeding on nectar, they'll come to all different kinds of flowers, but it's these caterpillars that we're talking about in terms of their specialization. So monarchs, all of the milkweed genus is Asclepius is an important one. And then during migration, so we're like right where we are right now, migrating birds they're feeding on insects, but they're also feeding really heavily on fruit in late summer and fall. So they come through wood thrush, which is here, the bird on the right, robins, migrating robins, all lots of different warblers, many of them feeding on fruit during the summer and the fall. And so think about some of the plants that will provide that fall fruit also. And again, with many of these native species, the fruits are very high in fat, and they need that high fat content. They also need a lot of water, and so that's why they like fruit also during the fall migration, because you're flying all night, and you know, it's a high energy, and so you've got to maximize you know, the energy that you're getting, and so they like these high fat content fruits for migrating. And so some of the native fruit producing plants that are really excellent for landscaping. Dogwoods are wonderful for landscaping. There are all kinds of, well, you have flowering dogwood, but gray dogwood and silky dogwood and red stem dogwood and all different kinds of dogwoods. And they have really highly preferred fruit, so they'll often be consumed, you know, in the next month or so. You know, when birds coming through, we'll feed on those. Cherries as a group are an important group, you know, black cherry, pin cherry, choke cherry. They're super important, both they're like second to oaks in terms of insects, plus that fruit is super important in terms of migrating birds. So, and of course for the plants, the plants that are trying to keep from being, you know, they're trying to keep from being eaten by insects, but then they want their fruit to be dispersed. So they do want their fruit to be, you know, dispersed. So you've got a lot of fleshy fruit that's there that they're trying to get so that others will feed on that. Viburnums are another, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I was just trying to see if I could send me a chat or something if I stop, if you can't hear me. But anyway, viburnums are also wonderful landscaping plants. They provide fruit in late summer and fall. And again, there are all kinds of different ones: nannyberry, arrowwood viburnum, highbush cranberry, lots of really, really beautiful ones for landscaping. And again, a super highly preferred one. Birds will come in and clean those out right away. And many of them also beautiful spring flowers. So this is black haw viburnum. And so they're really just great for, and they're generally small, are medium-sized shrubs to small trees, depending on where they're growing and how they're growing. And so they're really nice for adding that that mid-layer to, you've got, you know, sort of your oaks and cherries and birches as kind of your upper layer, maples, and then having this middle layer that's got, you know, the dogwoods and the viburnums. And, you know, we're talking backyards, but again, this is, you know, many of these are native to our forests, and having that mid-story layer is so important also there, you know, trying to do that. Serviceberry, it is a great one. It flowers early in the spring and then has that early fruit in June. But, you know, wood thrush robins will be feeding on that then. Serviceberry, I couldn't find, you know, I have so many pictures that are, who knows where they are. They were on my phone or on my, and I couldn't find them, but I know from early spring, I have a bunch of serviceberry in the woods. But if you're out in the woods in the spring, you can see the, you know, the white serviceberry flowers are one of the first ones that come out while the leaves haven't come out on the other trees. And so they're really pretty in terms of the forest also, but a great landscaping tree. Spice bush, one of my all-time favorites. And this is spice bush, again, is like a small shrub, small shrub to tree. It's got, when you crush the leaves, it's got kind of a really nice scent to it. It's got these beautiful bright red berries that are here right now, although they're being consumed, you know, as we speak. And then there also, the bark is kind of this speckled bark. And so again, it adds kind of a textural quality to your garden. And so it's a really nice addition. It's funny, we started, you know, we bought a spice bush and we're planting spice bush. And then anyway, then the more we got to know it, then we all of a sudden started realizing that we actually had it around in different places in the woods that we hadn't even noticed it before, or that it was covered up by something else. And so this is one that actually, it's a native species that in a lot of areas along edges, if you don't have a ton of honeysuckle or other things like that, spice bush is maybe there. This is the spice bush caterpillar. So it's really a crazy looking guy. And it is a specialist on spice bush and tulip poplar. And so it's again got a pretty restricted range. And then here's the adult of the spice bush swallowtail. And again, they'll come into, you know, once the butterflies will feed on the nectar of all different species. And here the spice bush swallowtail is feeding on cardinal flower, which is again one of my very favorites in terms of wildflowers and in terms of butterfly and hummingbird attractors. Buttonbush is one that we don't see that much of. It's a native shrub of wetland and riparian areas, but this is one, again, that butterflies just absolutely love. So this one is a big magnet for butterflies. I'm not sure, you know, I think we've debated about what the best places to plant this. I'm not really positive what the best places to plant this is, because some people have told me that it's areas like riparian areas where it's wet, really wet, but then it can be dry also. But then you also see them in more sort of wetland areas where, at least where the soil is moist all the time. But again, these seed heads have, you know, sort of an interesting, again, an interesting addition. Mountain ash is a tree, but it produces a super abundance of fruit, and that's one again where robins, cedar waxwings will come in and really be attracted to that. So kind of when you're thinking of plants, you think at sort of multiple functions, including, you know, what adds to your sort of design and what you want to look at, but also what they're providing at the same time. Black chokeberry, that's another one that's not that common, but it's one that I love. It really has multi-season interest. In the spring, it's got beautiful flowers. The leaves turn sort of different colors of orangish and greenish, and so they're kind of interesting. And then they get this beautiful fruit. And at the Arboretum at Penn State, they've got I think that I actually haven't been there recently, so I don't know, but they along the walkway there, they had kind of used it as a hedgerow, and it really it's really nice to look at it. And again, you can see here sort of the form. It's a you know, a dense sort of brushy form, but then it's got all these sort of interesting colors and textures associated with it. Sumac. Sumac is not one that people generally think of, in terms of planting for landscaping. But it's again super, I like the way it looks in the wintertime when you've got nothing else around. You can have these sort of, these spikes of seeds coming up. And this becomes an important emergency food. So for birds, we've got these really highly preferred fruits that are high fat and super good, and that would be spicebush and viburnums and dogwoods, but those are mostly eaten now. They'll be mostly consumed in the next few weeks. And so for birds, what ends up being a really critical time is when we get to about March, late February, March, and everything's been consumed that's been around, and there are no insects out yet. And so it's really a low period. And so that's when the birds turn to sort of what I call emergency food. It certainly would not be preferred, but so sumac is one of them. You'll see downy woodpeckers sitting on sumac. They'll actually pull those hairs off of them and eat the seeds. Hawthorns are another one that birds generally don't eat hawthorns till March. The fruit till March. And so it'll be one that'll be around and give you that late fruit. And so again, it's kind of thinking across the seasons also in terms of providing these links in the food chain. Winterberry holly. This is another one of my really favorite ones. Here it is, about right now, if birds aren't already eating it. And then if they make it through that sort of the fall migration time, then early winter, you can get places like this where you've got, huge amounts of fruit. Bluebirds love winterberry holly, so it's a big bird attractant. We have, again, at the Arboretum, like right along Park Avenue, right at the edge of that, the meadow there, the whatever they're calling that. Anyway, the meadow that they have, they've got a whole line of winterberry holly. And we had our ornithology class, started. We have a lab, and it starts in January. And so last January, we always try to go out every lab to get outside. And so it was January, the wind was whipping around. And so we were like, okay, well, we'll just walk across the street to the Arboretum. And so we walked across the street to the Arboretum, and there was that line of winterberry holly, and it still had the berries on it. And we probably had 10 bluebirds feeding on it. And so I think it made the year, especially because after the year, the class part of the year, the outdoor part ended in March when we went into quarantine. But, everybody was so excited because, here it is, it's this bleak winter day, the wind is howling, and then we go up there, and then there are these birds, and they're just flying down, picking off one at a time. And it really was just, it was inspirational and got everybody excited. We were just learning how to use binoculars, and then all of a sudden it's like, wow, all of this right in front of me. So winterberry holly is a big favorite. I also had, as part of my job as a wildlife extension, I get a lot of calls from people who have problems with wildlife. And so one of them was a person who raises winterberry holly for wreaths. He does Christmas wreaths. And so he was really upset because of all the birds eating the berries before he could make the Christmas wreaths, and wanted to know what he could do. Basically, all I could tell him was, you're going to have to net them, or net them to keep them out, because that's, that is what they are. They're very big bird attractants, and so anyway, so yes, I love winterberry holly. And then hardmast, I talk mostly about birds because that's what I work with, but hardmast, blue jays will feed on hardmast, but squirrels, chipmunks, all of those. And so again, you've got, things like oaks and beeches and hickories that are, again, both supporting those insects, native insects during the breeding season, but also hardmast during the other seasons. And then wildflower plantings, have really become of interest, and particularly for birds and pollinators, and then they provide that added visual interest. And really in recent, recent, I mean, I'd say in the last eight years or 10 years, people have become very much interested in these sort of wildflower gardens and places like Ernst Conservation Seeds and Prairie Nursery, and a lot of those companies have really shifted to producing these seed mixes, producing pollinator mixes, and you can get mixes for different areas and mixes for whether you want grasses associated with them or not, and so it's becoming it's becoming a lot of interest to the public, and certainly a lot of companies are starting to really try to help provide those sources of seed. And then, of course, I know you all know because you have your native plant sales, but all the native plant sales that people are having now, realizing this interest. Hummingbirds, attracting hummingbirds is of course a really popular activity. We still have hummingbirds. We had hummingbirds yesterday, but they'll be gone maybe in the next week, something like that. They'll be gone soon. But during the summer, they not only, of course, go to feeders, but they're attracted to particularly to red and orange and tubular flowers, but Monarda, columbine, trumpet creeper. I don't have a picture of trumpet honeysuckle, but that's another great one. And that one was one on the Pennsylvania, on the Facebook page, where Stan Catella had the picture of his house with or shed with the whole side of trumpet honeysuckle. And that's, again, one that hummingbirds just absolutely love. So conifers, hemlocks, pines, spruces, they provide winter cover and also nest sites, particularly for birds like mourning doves that will nest early in the season before maybe the deciduous trees have come out. But but in terms of winter cover, they're very important. You can, if you've got a hemlock, of course, we've had lots of trouble with hemlocks and hemlock woolly adelgid, but you've got, places where birds will forage underneath there, or, if you go up to one, they'll be all roosting inside the, in along the branch, along the trunk, protected from the snow on the outside. So when designing your space, think about the 4 components of wildlife habitat, which is food. And again, we've been talking a lot about that. Cover. And so many of these plants are also that are providing food are also providing that cover. Water. There's nothing like water to attract birds. I mean, that's water, and it's particularly if you can get moving water, is a really great addition to any backyard, is having that water feature. And then places and spaces to raise young, and that again, those sort of your shrubs, your trees are going to be providing that, but also you can add nest boxes as an additional source of cover. So most of the time, or many times in backyards, people feel the need to clean up, and they'll, remove dead branches, remove down material, prune trees, and cavity trees and snags can have an important habitat element. So obviously, you don't want something big that's going to fall on your house, but look and see where things are. So this is a black-capped chickadee. Some people don't know this, but black-capped chickadees are actually primary excavators, like a woodpecker, which means that they actually make their own nest cavity. And they like really soft, punky wood. So places where maybe an aspen tree is broken off, or you have an old stump that maybe has a place where they can put a nest in, or a snag. So here's they're coming out of a cavity where they're nesting here. And again, if you read Doug Talamay's books or hear him talk, he talks about the importance also of this for all your bees and pollinators and things like that. People are trying to build bee hotels and all of that, but it's really these, some of this dead wood, snags. And again, you've got to, think where you want it, where you have it, but just don't think I need to clean everything up, because clean is definitely not the best. Nest boxes are used by what are called secondary cavity nesters. So primary cavity nesters would be something like a woodpecker that actually makes their cavities. Secondary cavity nesters, house wren, Carolina wren, white-breasted nuthatch, tufted titmouse, all of those, bluebirds, eastern tree swallows, they will nest in nest boxes. And so by having nest boxes, you can also, provide places for them in their garden, depending on where they're placed and what vegetation they're near. You'll get different species. But that's a great way for people to get a, to get kind of to be able to visually watch that and watch the whole sort of life cycle occurring. And then, as I said earlier, water is great both in the summer and in the winter. And if you can have moving water, I'm still working on that, trying to figure out the best way to do that. But something that keeps the water moving, that movement will attract birds. And then also having water available in the winter. So having it having it heated or something like that. And I want to just stop for a second here, and just because it reminded me of it, is that at Penn State, there's a bird and pollinator garden that's going in, and it should be, I guess it should be opening I think by the beginning of next spring. But anyway, they're going to have some really neat water features in there. They've got some great big boulders that were carved out by the same person who did the watershed map that they've got. And then it's going to have a feature where the water goes down into another boulder, and it's going to be continuously moving and heated during the winter. So it's going to be really exciting to see that come together. We talked about this earlier, with the ordinances, but yeah, minimizing lawns. And so Doug Tallamy in his book, Nature's Best Hope, is basically, we need to get rid of the lawn, and not get rid of it altogether, because people like it for some things. But he said if everybody just had half the lawn that they have now, we could make a gigantic difference. And so think about, how can you replace that lawn? That lawns are really biological deserts. They don't do anything for any other species. You may want to, have some lawn for a picnic area, or lawn for a volleyball court, or lawn for whatever, but think about how much you really need, and then try to minimize that lawn by doing other plantings. And I know sometimes people get intimidated by it, and so I would say with getting rid of your lawn is start small. And so here, you could see the lawn used to go all the way up to the road, and so here it was replacing it with just a small space with a wildflower garden. In this case, it's taking a middle section of the lawn, and the idea is going to be that that this will eventually all be shrubs, and shrubs and an island of shrubs with the lawn, with paths of lawn around it. And so if you kind of think about it like this, and you work on the pieces, and the time when you've got it, or on the year when you've got it, you can kind of build it outward from that. Remove invasives and replant with natives. So depending again on where you live, but if you live particularly around here in central Pennsylvania, if your house was in a place that was once woods and then they made an opening, then pretty much all around the edge of that is going to be honeysuckle coming in. And even where I live, when I first moved in, it was rubus, and then it was all honeysuckle within a few years. And so pulling out the honeysuckle, and then replanting, this of course isn't the same area, but replanting with native species, or in some cases, you may find that there are native species hidden in there. So this is pulling out honeysuckle. This is actually, it looks really raggedy here, but it's actually a black haw viburnum that was just totally beaten down and covered up by everything else. So, so pulling those things out, and then also, the other side, maybe you're in a field that was a farmed area, and then what became houses. In those areas, again, honeysuckle, multiflora rose are big issues, so you need to get rid of those. But then at the same time, planting with what you decided are your preferred native plants. As you might have seen in the other pictures, there were fencing around a lot of those plants that were going in, and that's because deer can be or are a major issue. Now, where I live, it's it's outside of State College, but it's a little development. So you've got we've got ag fields on one side, we've got game lands on one side, and then a little cluster of houses. And of course, the deer just pack in there, and and they're very bold, and they eat everything. And so you've got to be prepared for that. You've got to figure out what to do with that. And in most cases, that means fencing, at least until the plants get a pretty good start. Maximize vertical structure and layering. And so what you want is to have not just like a single tree with mowed lawn around it, but to have maybe trees with shrubs and then with herbaceous cover below that. And I've been saying that for a long time, just in terms of birds, because birds will divide up the habitat vertically, and so that you've got different birds that are using that mid-story than the upper story. But I was listening to Doug Tallamay give a talk, and he was talking about a lot of the insects that will pupate in species like oak, and then they drop those pupa onto the ground, and then they burrow into the ground to spend the winter. And if it's just a hardscape or a mowed area, they don't survive. And so then you're almost like an ecological trap, because you're drawing them into an area that can't fulfill their life cycle. And so you kind of want around your trees to have a ground cover, mulch, something like that, that you can, shrubs that you can kind of have, again, these islands of habitat. So create blocks of habitat, again, instead of like an isolated tree. Think multi-season when designing your space and selecting your plants. So again, trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants that support insects for the breeding season, fruit-bearing trees and shrubs for the summer and for those migrants, winter cover and to support birds during that winter period, and then that winter emergency food. So something that may not be super preferred and eaten right now, but will be important later on. And then finally, work within your community to create natural areas in public spaces. And this is important because two things. One, I don't think we want to be so focused on, just has to be, you've got to be a homeowner to be able to do anything, because that's not true. And the other one is that we really want our public spaces to take this on, to be contributing, to be more interesting, and to be really contributing to preserving our natural environment. This is a park in State College. And again, they've got the signage. So, when we started, I think maybe it was before the meeting started, but talking about zoning ordinances. And part of zoning ordinances is people understanding what's the importance of it. And so instead of like, well, why didn't they just take the effort and mow the lawn? It's putting up a sign that says, why do we have this? Why is it important here? You can see the soccer field down below. But here's a trail that goes through, and it's got, warm season, big blue stem and switchgrass and things like that. And we've got another park that's got a big butterfly garden. But so part of it's educational and, putting a sign up. I did an extension publication a long time ago called Neighborly Natural Landscapes. But again, putting a sign up, putting a fence around it makes people think, oh, okay, they meant to do it. It's not just that they're not caring for it. So partly it's you want people to know that you're caring for it. I do think changing those ordinances are super important. And I do think that part of it's education, and that people now, because of the pandemic, and we've been spending so much more time in smaller areas and getting to know sort of the natural areas around us, that it's becoming more and more important to people. And I think the whole sort of mental health research that's done about the importance of getting people outside, getting people to see nature is means the time is really prime now, that and the things like climate change and all the, you know, loss of biodiversity, that we really are in a time now that's prime for people getting involved in that. I think the public understands it, is interested in it, and it really is a time we can move forward with that. And then finally, enjoy that space. You know, as I said, migrants are coming through, you know, so get outside, look at the butterflies, the warblers, the things that are moving through, and enjoy that space and the wildlife that share it with you. So thank you. I said for additional information, we have a Penn State Extension Forestry and Wildlife site, and on that I have a set of fact sheets. Some of them are kind of out of date, but most of them are still pretty good on landscaping for wildlife. And so they've got information on some of these, like the trees and shrubs, and ideas for ones that you can select. And so thank you. And